4:47 a.m. East Akron, Ohio. A mechanical ram hit the roll-up door of a shuttered auto body garage on the 2200 block of East Carver Avenue. The steel buckled on the first strike. On the second, it gave. 14 agents from the FBI Cleveland field office poured through the breach. Behind them, a secondary HRT element moved along the exterior wall toward the back of the building, toward a reinforced steel plate that no building permit had ever recorded, behind a paint booth that hadn't been operational in 3 years. The primary team cleared the front bay in under 40 seconds. Oil drums, stripped engine blocks, a hydraulic lift frozen in the down position. Empty. The secondary team reached the steel plate. They used a hydraulic spreader. The plate came away from the frame at 4:51 a.m. What was behind it had been there for 156 days. And the only reason anyone knew to look was a single line on page 47 of a sealed federal indictment, a line about a water meter that should never have caught anyone's attention. This is the story of how one number in one utility record ended 156 days of silence. The indictment against the Carver Avenue cell had been building since October of 2025. The Northern Ohio Organized Crime Unit had been tracking fentanyl distribution through Summit County for the better part of a year. Pill presses moving product through auto shops, corner bodegas, informal courier networks. The operation wasn't sophisticated in ways federal prosecutors typically measure, but it spread quietly through structures that looked solid from outside. What that investigation looked like day to day is worth understanding before the case turns. The task force assigned to Summit County maintained rotating surveillance across the 4 primary target locations. 2 agents per vehicle. 12-hour shifts. Encrypted radio. Sustained, methodical coverage of the kind federal operations require, and that television drastically understates in duration and overstates in action. Most surveillance is empty hours. You sit in a car on a street corner for 12 hours and see nothing that moves the case forward. Then you sit there again the next day. The Carver Avenue garage had been under intermittent surveillance since November of 2025. Logged vehicles, photographed individuals, documented delivery times. None of the visual surveillance caught anything unusual behind the paint booth. The booth itself was visible from the street through a side window. It looked exactly like what a decommissioned paint booth looks like. Dusty, inactive, equipment nobody had bothered removing from a building they were using for other purposes. The steel plate behind it wasn't visible from any exterior vantage point. The task force had no reason to look for it. By late January of 2026, the DEA's Detroit division had enough for a federal case. 14 names. Documented wire transfers. Controlled buys at 4 separate locations. Intercepted communications spanning 16 weeks. The kind of evidence a federal grand jury accepts without question. The wire intercepts matter because of what they caught and what they missed. The communication surveillance ran on 7 devices across the 14-defendant network. 6 of those devices used encrypted messaging apps that the warrants captured in plain text through a lawful access process the court records don't detail beyond a statutory citation. The 7th device, a prepaid handset used by the primary distribution coordinator, was never fully decrypted. Partial extraction returned 412 message fragments, of which 309 were considered evidence. The remaining 103 were either corrupted or encrypted under a secondary layer the forensic team hadn't cracked by indictment date. Federal prosecutors decided to proceed without those fragments. The logic was straightforward. The evidence package was already sufficient. The unknown 103 fragments were a gap, not a barrier. Nobody flagged them as potentially relevant to anything beyond logistics. They were listed as outstanding forensic items and moved to the supplemental evidence file. The indictment was sealed on February 3, 2026. 47 pages. 14 defendants listed in the caption. The takedown was scheduled for a Tuesday in mid-July, timed to a separate operation in Cuyahoga County that would hit 3 affiliated distribution points simultaneously. Then a prosecutor in the Northern District of Ohio opened the indictment one more time on a Thursday afternoon in late June, looking for something else entirely, and found a name she didn't recognize. Page 3. Caption block. Defendant 15. AR co-tenant. 2200 block East Carver Avenue, Akron, Ohio. No prior warrant. No wire intercept. No informant file. No DEA target designation. Just a name and an address, the same address as the garage. The prosecutor flagged the entry to the case agent assigned to the Summit County portion of the investigation. The assumption was administrative error. A co-signer on a lease swept into the caption by accident. It happened. Federal indictments weren't immune to clerical mistakes. The case agent pulled the lease documentation for the Carver Avenue property. The lease listed 2 tenants. One was a named defendant. The other was AR. The lease had been signed in September of 2025. AR's signature was on page 2. One detail pulled me back every time I went through the case file. The utility accounts for the Carver Avenue address weren't registered to the Shell LLC that held the lease. They were registered to AR personally. That meant her name appeared in the Ohio Edison Billing Database, the Municipal Water Authority Database, and the Akron Gas Utility Database, 3 separate public record systems, and had never surfaced in 16 months of financial surveillance, targeting every name associated with the property. The case agent requested the utility records on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the Water Authority had responded. The meter at the Carver Avenue address had been running continuously since February 9, 2026. Not intermittently. Continuously. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 143 days at the time of the pull. Total consumption, 412,000 gallons. For a 2-bedroom rental with no industrial water usage on file, the expected annual consumption would be approximately 45,000 gallons. The Carver Avenue address had consumed 9 times that amount in less than 5 months. 412,000 gallons isn't a plumbing accident. A leak large enough to produce that volume would be visible from the street. A burst main would have triggered automatic alerts through the municipal system. What continuous water consumption suggests, in an industrial building with a sealed rear addition, is a sustained sanitation load, the kind produced by people living in a space not designed for habitation. The case agent brought the utility data to the prosecutor the same evening. They called the FBI Cleveland field office at 9:47 p.m. By 10:30, a subpoena had been drafted for the Ohio Edison power consumption records at the same address. Those came back within the hour. The electrical draw at the Carver Avenue garage had spiked in the second week of February and never dropped. The pattern matched industrial equipment running on a continuous cycle. Pill presses, ventilation, heat, and something else, a secondary circuit drawing steady low-level current. The kind of draw produced by multiple personal electronic devices charging simultaneously, or by overhead fluorescent lights running around the clock in a space with no windows. The FBI's Cleveland field office activated its operational cell at 11:15 p.m. on June 27, 2026. What had been a narcotics takedown scheduled for mid-July became something different entirely. The case agent contacted the DEA Detroit Division's senior coordinator at 11:49 p.m. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Summary: the Carver Avenue garage was not only a fentanyl distribution hub. There was a sealed room behind the paint booth, unregistered on any building permit, drawing utilities consistent with continuous human occupation. The 14-defendant drug indictment was about to become a 15-defendant indictment with a federal rescue operation folded inside it. The DEA coordinator asked one question: how confident are you? The case agent's answer, recorded in the operational log: very confident. What most people assume about federal rescue operations is that the hard part is getting through the door. The evidence suggests otherwise. The hard part is the 23 hours before. The FBI's hostage rescue team element assigned to the Cleveland field office began pre-operational planning at midnight. Architectural records showed the Carver Avenue building's original footprint, a standard auto body bay, roughly 60 feet by 40 feet, built in 1987. But aerial thermal imaging, requested and returned within 4 hours through a standing Federal Aviation Authority connection, showed a rear heat signature that didn't match the blueprint. The addition behind the paint booth was approximately 22 feet by 30 feet. It had been constructed after the original building. The thermal profile of the wall materials differed from the primary structure. No permit. No inspection record. No certificate of occupancy. It had been built quietly, inside an existing structure, in a part of Akron where nobody was looking for new construction. The HRT element needed to know what was on the other side of that steel plate before they hit it. They had one option: a fiber optic acoustic sensor threaded through an exterior gap in the corrugated wall panel. They deployed it at 2:14 a.m. What's most striking about what they heard is not that it confirmed human presence. It's that it confirmed 8 separate breathing patterns. Distinct. Consistent. 8 people. The HRT team lead adjusted the breach plan at 2:41 a.m. The secondary element would take the reinforced steel plate with a hydraulic spreader rather than explosive charge. Slower, but it eliminated fragmentation risk inside a confined space with confirmed civilian presence. At 3:15 a.m., the operation moved from planning to staging. Here is where the case gets complicated, in ways the indictment caption didn't predict. The 14 named defendants were not all present at the Carver Avenue location the night of the operation. Surveillance confirmed 8 individuals inside the main bay. 6 of the 14 indicted suspects were elsewhere, at affiliated addresses in Cuyahoga County, at a residence in Barberton, and, in one case, at a location in western Pennsylvania that hadn't previously appeared in the case file. The FBI field office had a decision to make: move on the Carver Avenue location only and risk alerting the 6 remaining defendants before they could be secured, or hold the operation and coordinate a simultaneous multi-location takedown, which would require another 36 hours of logistics, minimum. The case agent raised the concern at 3:22 a.m. The prosecutor's response was immediate. They couldn't wait 36 hours. The water consumption data had been subpoenaed through channels the defense could later reconstruct. If any of the 6 off-site defendants had access to a contact inside the utility authority, not an established fact, but a risk federal practice required taking seriously, the operational window was closing. What strikes us about this decision is what it says about the geometry of federal rescue operations. Every element of the case had been built toward a tidy, simultaneous takedown. And then one utility record tore that geometry apart. The agents had 9 hours to rebuild it. The FBI's Cleveland field office contacted the Cuyahoga County Resident Agency and the Pittsburgh field office at 3:31 a.m. Coordination calls lasted 44 minutes. By 4:15 a.m., surveillance teams were in position at the Barberton address and the Cuyahoga sites. The Pennsylvania location was handled through a separate warrant process that ran concurrent with the Ohio operation and which falls outside the scope of this account. The Carver Avenue takedown was confirmed for 4:47 a.m. Put yourself in the position of the HRT secondary element at 4:46 a.m., standing in the dark against the corrugated exterior wall of a building you've never entered, holding a hydraulic spreader, knowing that 8 people are breathing on the other side of a steel plate, and that you have exactly 60 seconds from the moment the roll-up door goes to get that plate off its frame. One thing that didn't go according to plan: the hydraulic spreader's pressure coupling had stiffened in the pre-dawn cold. Temperature at 4:47 a.m. on the east side of Akron, Ohio, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The coupling required a manual override that added 11 seconds to the breach timeline. 11 seconds is a long time when a primary element is already inside a building, clearing an unknown number of armed individuals. The secondary team's senior operator performed the override without requesting a hold on primary breach. The decision is noted in the after-action report without editorial comment. It was the right call. The steel plate separated from the frame at 4:51 a.m., 14 seconds after the primary element completed its sweep of the main bay. Inside the sealed addition, 8 mattresses arranged against 3 walls. 2 industrial pill presses, neither in operation. A ventilation unit running on a dedicated circuit. A utility sink. Overhead fluorescent lighting, continuous. 8 adults, ages 22 to 27. 6 of the 8 had been reported missing from towns across Ohio and western Pennsylvania between February and June of 2026. One was a 24-year-old intensive care unit nurse from Youngstown who had last been seen leaving a night shift at St. Elizabeth Boardman Hospital on February 9th. Her mother had filed a missing persons report the following morning. The Youngstown Police Department had classified the case as a voluntary absence after 30 days with no evidence of foul play. One was a 23-year-old baker from Erie, Pennsylvania, who had gone to a job interview on March 14th and hadn't come home. Her roommate had reported her missing the same day. The Erie Police Department had an open case file. A third had been reported missing from Canton in late April. A fourth from Massillon. A fifth from a suburb of Cleveland whose name appears in the operational record only as a geographic reference. The sixth had been reported missing from Steubenville in early June. The remaining 2 had not been reported missing. Their presence in the sealed room was the first indication to law enforcement that they had been taken. All 8 were transported by Summit County EMS to Summa Akron City Hospital, beginning at 5:14 a.m. All 8 were triaged on arrival. Medical records are sealed under federal protective order. The clinical summary entered into the operational log notes that all 8 required intravenous fluid administration, and that all 8 had been in continuous confinement for an extended period. The attending physician's notation reads, "Conditions consistent with prolonged isolation." What the triage team at Summa Akron encountered that morning deserves more than a clinical note, and details that filtered into the case record through FBI Victim Services documentation add context the summary omits. The women had developed a system of marks on the interior wall of the sealed room, scratch marks tallied in groups, a count of days maintained in the absence of any other method of measuring time. The FBI Evidence Response Team photographed and documented those marks as part of the scene processing. The tally reached 154, 2 days short of the actual duration. The discrepancy was never fully explained. The most straightforward reading is that whoever was keeping the count missed 2 days, through illness, through exhaustion, through whatever internal arithmetic breaks down inside a sealed room with no windows and no variation in the fluorescent light overhead. 154 marks on a concrete wall. The 2 missing days sitting somewhere in the space between what the water meter recorded and what a person was capable of sustaining. The FBI Victim Services Coordinator who arrived at Summa Akron at 6:45 a.m. was responsible for initial contact with all 8 women before formal investigative interviews could be scheduled. The coordinator's intake notes, portions of which appear in the case record without identifying information, describe the process of explaining to each woman, individually, that the building they had been inside for months was no longer a place they would return to, that the people who had kept them there were in custody, that the date was June 28, 2026. For several of the women, the date required explanation. The internal count on the wall had given them a duration but not an anchor. They knew how many days. They didn't know what day it was when they had started. 15 defendants were in federal custody by 7 a.m. on June 28, 2026. The 6 off-site arrests were executed within 22 minutes of the Carver Avenue breach. The Barberton and Cuyahoga teams had held position and moved the moment the primary operation confirmed secure. The 15th defendant, AR herself, was not among the 8 women recovered from the sealed room. She had been listed on the lease and the utility accounts, but her whereabouts on the night of the operation were unknown. The warrant for her arrest was outstanding as of the indictment's unsealing. The question of AR's role in the Carver Avenue operation is addressed in the sealed portions of the indictment in language the unsealed summary describes as organizational. That word carries specific weight in federal charging documents. Organizational means she was not peripheral. It means the grand jury saw evidence that she was part of how the operation functioned, not an incidental name on a lease. The utility accounts in her name were not a bureaucratic accident. They were a structural choice, a decision to put the accounts in a name that wasn't flagged, that had no prior DEA exposure, that would pass through a financial surveillance sweep without catching. It worked for 16 months. A name that should have been in the case file from October of 2025 wasn't in the case file until a Thursday afternoon in late June. That's not coincidence. That's the operational logic of someone who understood how financial surveillance works and built a gap into it deliberately. The first formal investigative interview of one of the 8 women was conducted by FBI special agents on June 29, 2026, at Summa Akron City Hospital. The interview was recorded, with the subject's consent, and a summary appears in the case record under a victim identifier assigned by the Bureau's Victim Services Unit. The summary describes a pattern of initial contact traced to a social media interaction in January of 2026. A direct message from an account purporting to represent a regional healthcare staffing agency, offering contract nursing positions in the Summit County area with above-market compensation and immediate start dates. The account had been active for 11 months at the time of contact. It had a professional design. It had fabricated reviews. It had a website linked in its profile that resolved to a legitimately registered domain purchased 8 months prior. The subject had done what any reasonable person would do. She looked the agency up, found a professional-looking online presence, and agreed to an in-person interview at an address in Akron. The address was the Carver Avenue garage. The interview was the last thing she remembered doing freely for 156 days. The staffing agency account and website were identified, traced, and seized by FBI Cyber Division within 48 hours of the operation. The domain registration led to a third-party privacy service with a registered address in a country that doesn't maintain a mutual legal assistance treaty with the United States. The social media account had been created from an IP address associated with a commercial VPN provider. The digital infrastructure was designed to be found, professional enough to be convincing at the point of contact, and to be untraceable after the fact. The FBI cyber team's assessment, entered into the operational record on July 2nd, was that the digital infrastructure had been constructed by someone with familiarity with operational security practices specific to online fraud and recruitment schemes. The assessment noted that similar infrastructure patterns had been identified in 2 previous federal investigations in other districts, neither of which had resulted in charges related to the digital elements of the scheme. The FBI presented that assessment to the case prosecutor on July 3rd. The prosecutor requested that the assessment be preserved as a supplemental exhibit rather than incorporated into the existing indictment. The reasoning noted in the case strategy documentation: the existing indictment was complete and pending initial pleas. Adding new charges would delay proceedings and potentially complicate the sentencing posture for defendants who had already indicated willingness to cooperate. The digital infrastructure would be addressed in subsequent proceedings. As of the unsealing date of July 17th, those subsequent proceedings had not been filed. Here is the detail that didn't make the news cycle, and the one that has stayed with me since I went through the case record. The water meter data that cracked this case was available from the day the Summit County investigation began. The utility records for the Carver Avenue address were, by definition, part of the public infrastructure records for that property. Any financial subpoena targeting the garage would have returned them. No financial subpoena targeting the garage had included the utility accounts, because the utility accounts were in AR's name, and AR's name wasn't in the investigation. She had been on the lease for 7 months before anyone in the federal case file ever looked at her. 156 days of running water. 9 times the expected volume for a 2-bedroom rental. And it took a prosecutor checking a caption page for a clerical error to find it. Here's the take that will probably get pushback. The system didn't fail these women at the moment of the raid. The system built a 16-month narcotics case and left a co-tenant utility record sitting in a public database, untouched, for the entire duration. Whether earlier discovery was possible is not a question about federal capability. It's a question about federal focus. The 14 named defendants were the target. Everything adjacent to them was background. AR's name in a utility database was background. Background is where people disappear. A procedural reform discussion has been circulating in federal law enforcement circles in the months since the Carver Avenue operation. It doesn't appear in any public document. What is filtered through the case record and operational materials is a consistent acknowledgement that the utility record gap was a procedural gap, not an investigative failure attributable to any individual agent or decision, but a structural omission in how financial surveillance subpoenas are scoped. The standard practice in narcotics investigations is to follow the money in the names the investigation has already identified. Accounts held by individuals outside the target list require predicate before a subpoena can be generated. AR had no predicate. She wasn't a target. She was a name on a lease document that nobody had fully reviewed. The reform being discussed, and it's only being discussed, not implemented, as of the date of this account, is a utility cross-reference requirement, a step that would flag any utility account registered to an individual not already in the target list, for properties under active financial surveillance. A small change. The kind of change that takes a name in a public database and makes it visible before 156 days pass. The sealed indictment was unsealed on July 17, 2026, following the entry of initial pleas by multiple defendants. The charges span federal narcotics distribution, conspiracy to distribute Schedule II controlled substances, maintaining a drug-involved premises, and federal counts related to the captivity of the 8 women that the indictment describes, in language drawn from statute, as unlawful restraint and forced labor. The sentencing exposure for the lead defendants, based on the charge structure and the drug quantity attributable under federal guidelines, begins at 15 years. Several defendants face substantially higher exposure based on their alleged roles in the operation of the sealed room. Federal sentencing hearings hadn't been scheduled as of the date of this account. The pill presses recovered from inside the sealed edition had been in operation for an estimated 4 to 5 months, based on mechanical wear analysis conducted by the DEA Forensic Laboratory in Quantico. The quantity of fentanyl product attributable to that operation, while not publicly specified in the unsealed indictment, is referenced in sealed exhibits as sufficient to represent a significant distribution supply for Summit County and adjacent markets. The forensic processing of the sealed room at Carver Avenue took 4 days. The FBI evidence response team worked in 2-shift rotations, documenting every surface, every item, every mark. The mattresses were photographed in place before removal. The utility sink was swabbed. The ventilation unit was disassembled and each component cataloged separately. The pill presses, 2 units, model designations redacted in the public record, were photographed, fingerprinted, and transported to the DEA evidence facility in Columbus. The fluorescent light fixtures were documented with their operational hours, read from the electronic ballasts, which confirmed continuous operation since the 2nd week of February. The floor of the sealed room was concrete, poured at a different time than the original building slab, a detail the forensic team noted in the structural analysis section of the evidence report. Whoever built the room had poured a new floor. The original building slab had an expansion joint running through the space that the new pour covered. You could see it at the edges, where the new concrete met the original. The room had been built to last. It had been built with enough attention to detail that it had lasted 156 days without detection by a federal task force that was inside the building's surveillance perimeter for 7 months. The 2 women who had not been reported missing were identified through federal records. Both are Ohio residents. Both were over the age of 22. Their families were notified through FBI Victim Services the morning of June 28th. No additional detail about their circumstances prior to February has been made public. The Erie baker, 23 years old, had been saving to take a pastry certification course, her roommate told investigators, and had gone to the interview wearing her good coat because March in Erie is still cold, spent 11 days at Summa Akron City before being discharged to her family. Her open missing persons file in the Erie Police Department system was formally closed on July 1, 2026. The Youngstown nurse had been classified as a voluntary absence for 30 of the 156 days she was inside that room. The Youngstown Police Department's classification was administratively corrected on June 29th. The story of the Canton woman is not in the public record in any meaningful detail, but the case file contains a reference to an interview notation that describes her as the individual believed to have maintained the day count on the wall. The tally of 154 marks. The notation doesn't explain how the FBI determined she was responsible, or whether she confirmed it herself in the interview. What the notation says is that she asked, when the Victim Services Coordinator explained the date, whether the count was close. The coordinator confirmed it was close. The notation records her response as a single word. The word isn't transcribed in the public portion of the record. The notation describes it as quiet. The case agent who pulled the utility records on a Friday afternoon in late June, the person who took a flagged name in a caption block and turned it into a subpoena within 18 hours, isn't named in any public filing. Federal practice doesn't require it. The operational log entry for the utility subpoena is dated June 27, 2026, at 2:17 p.m. It is one line. It references an administrative case number and a utility authority account number. It doesn't describe what the agent thought when the 412,000-gallon figure came back. There's a line in the operational log that reads almost like something other than bureaucratic documentation: water consumption data returned. Initiating secondary review. Secondary review. That's what they called it. A notation that doesn't begin to carry the weight of what it started. The after-action review conducted by the FBI Cleveland Field Office was completed on July 8, 2026. It is a classified document. What has entered the public record through the unsealed indictment materials and through the FBI's public affairs summary is a single paragraph that acknowledges the utility data as the triggering evidence and describes the operational timeline from subpoena to breach as 9 hours and 34 minutes. The paragraph doesn't assess whether that timeline could have been shorter. It doesn't assess whether the utility accounts should have been identified earlier. It describes the operation as successfully executed with all primary objectives achieved. That framing is accurate. It's also the narrowest possible frame for a case that took 156 days longer than it should have. Comment more if you want part 2. There's a thread in the Pennsylvania location that never made it into the unsealed indictment, and that connects to a second property that federal investigators didn't publicly acknowledge until July 14th. The Carver Avenue cell is dismantled. 15 defendants in federal custody. 8 women recovered. A water meter running at 9 times normal volume for 156 days, the only anomaly in a case file that ran to hundreds of pages and 16 months of active investigation. AR remains at large as of July 19, 2026. Her current location is unknown. The warrant for her arrest is active in federal databases across multiple districts. The 2 industrial pill presses recovered from the sealed edition have been logged into DEA evidence. The distribution network that sourced the raw materials for those presses, the upstream supply chain that fed the Carver Avenue operation, hasn't been publicly addressed in any filed document. The indictment names 14 people and a 15th whose address is known. It doesn't name whoever was above them. In federal narcotics cases of this scale, there's almost always someone above them. The sealed room has been processed by the FBI Evidence Response Team. The mattresses, the utility sink, the ventilation unit running on its dedicated circuit, all cataloged. The building permit records for the Akron Department of Building Inspection show no approved construction at the Carver Avenue address after 1991. Whoever built that room built it to disappear. And for 156 days, it did. The water meter didn't know to keep